welcome to Your Intended Message. My guest today is Alex Sanfilippo. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Alex. And these 3 facts are organized in 3 phases of his business life. He started as a young entrepreneur at the age of 10, collecting and selling used golf balls. That led to him developing a video touring package for real estate developers, real estate salespeople. And eventually when he turned 18, he got into real estate so heavily, he was dying to invest his money. And unfortunately, he ran into the recession of 07, 09 and kissed that money bye-bye. Then he went and did what a lot of entrepreneurs do after bad experience, and he got a job. Ooh, the job, the J-O-B. 15 years, he started out in a good place to start. He started out breaking down boxes and taking out the trash in the aerospace industry, eventually making it to senior VP. Left that world and came back to entrepreneurship, went through few roles, including coaching, speaking, and then he came upon this world called podcasting. He started with his own podcast called Creating a Brand. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, he noticed, there's a lot of podcasts out there and people seem to need help getting their podcasts out. And he launched 3 services. We'll talk a little bit about them later. The first one was Podmatch.com, which is a place for podcast guests and podcast hosts to find each other and start that relationship. PodcastSOP.com, SOP standing for Standard Operating Procedures, which is important because I've learned that. I've written down procedures for everything, and he's done that service for other podcasters. And then the most recent production is Pod Pros, which is an educational service for both hosts and guests and wannabes, for wannabe guests, wannabe hosts. Alex Sanfilippo, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, thank you so much for having me. First off, you're hired. That was like the best introduction I've ever had on a podcast. And I've literally been on hundreds of them. I love that. So I'm going to be sharing that with my audience alone right there. But thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Alex. I'm excited to be talking to you because we do share some interest in the podcasting world, and we both share the interest of understanding how it needs to be systematic. You need to have a method because it's a lot of work. And now, Alex, you started your podcast. I'm curious about that. Let's talk about that first. Your podcast you started called Creating a Brand. What was your purpose in starting the podcast?
Yeah, George, this goes really well with the name of your podcast, Your Intended Message, right? My intended messaging was to create a brand. Like that's what I wanted to do, right? So I was trying to make sure my messaging was all around that. And yes, you're supposed to start a podcast for other people who are listening, but initially maybe I had the wrong idea. I was starting it for me because as you mentioned, I was in aerospace for 15 years. After 15 years in a corporate job and getting high up into the company, there's a lot of perks that come with that paycheck. And those perks make it really hard to leave the day that you decide you want to, right? Like when you're gonna be like, okay, I'm going to give up the salary, but also all these other things. I hadn't paid a phone bill in a really long time. Let's put it that way. T-Mobile, I didn't even know how to pay a T-Mobile bill. My company was handling all that. But I knew that it was something I wanted to do. And when I was sitting down, I'm like, you know what? I want to create a brand. Like that's what I want to do. I'm going to call the podcast that. I'm going to bring on people who have successfully left their careers and moved into entrepreneurship somehow, some way, so that I can start learning it. Very quickly, I learned that it needed to be for other people, not just for me. So I shifted my abilities to have a good interview, but still kept the same interest because in my mind, I wanted to do that same thing. And that's really what got me started in podcasting was just being interested in the space, but also just helping myself and helping other people potentially get out of a 9-to-5 job if that's something they wanted to do.
Now, and I find it curious that the podcasting itself, we get into it because we get in for selfish reasons. We want to promote our brand. We want to build our following. And I want to do that too. However, I also, more importantly, I only want to do that if I can offer value to my listeners. If they can take away value, ideas, maybe even inspiration, then I feel good. Because one, I've gained from the guest, and my listeners have gained as well. And so it's an interesting symbiotic relationship that we have with our podcasts and our audiences.
Yeah, that actually leads me straight to a question for you, if it's okay. I'm also a podcast host, as you mentioned, so I'm going to have questions, of course. But when you started off more on the, I'm just going to do air quotes here, like selfish side of things, right? Starting because you wanted to increase your influence and things like that. Did you see growth happen on your podcast, or was it not until you shifted it to being more focused on helping other people on the way? Did you see like a clear indication there?
And you're right, Alex. It doesn't grow significantly until your listeners realize that you're there for them. You're not there for yourself. And they can tell. They can tell. they can tell. So yeah, that's a valuable point. And I think that's probably a valuable point for most businesses.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more, because think about it. Like, businesses that get into business to make money for themselves aren't focused on the quality of the product necessarily, or the service that they have, whatever it might be. They're more focused on, okay, this is going to get us rich. Now, that I do believe that has to be a byproduct. Maybe not even get rich, but it has to at least pay the bills, or you're not going to be helping people for very long. Whenever somebody asks me, it's funny, George, whenever someone asks me why I don't do certain services for free, I'm like, because I want to help more people. And if I give it to you and 10 of your friends, then I'm out of business and I helped 11 people total, right? Like, I need to be able to do both, but it has to start with value. And for me, with my podcast, to kind of bring that full circle, it didn't start really doing well until I kind of pulled myself out of the equation a little bit. Now, I still had the curiosity. I think that's what actually helped the questions be valid and good and things like that. But it wasn't until I decided, okay, I have to help the listener go from A to B, not just myself. When I had that mindset shift, which was very minimal on the show, like you could barely even hear the difference in the way I was asking questions, but it made a big enough difference in my audience overnight, just started to skyrocket.
And Alex, let's talk about some of the services that you launched, because there's a lot of the whole podcast universe is a universe that is new to most people. Other than people know, well, I listen to the podcast, but what about what's going on behind the scenes, what it takes to get started? And certainly Podmatch I found to be a useful service. It's a place where hosts and guests can come together, and it doesn't mean that you have to talk to everybody who knocks on your door, but you've posted, people post their profiles there. They say something about themselves and their expertise, and they can reach out to hosts with a message, and then we go from there. And so I have included, as you know, people from Podmatch, and there are, and some people do it well and some people do it poorly. Have you noticed, what are the things that people do well?
Yeah, so the things that do well, just to have some clarity here in regards to like actually pitching themselves to be on shows or to find guests, right? Yeah, that side of things. Most people get it wrong, George. I hate to mention that. This show is perfect. I love the title of it, Your Intended Message, because you have to know why you're reaching out. You can't just throw a bunch of information out there. Like, George, when I reached out to you, I didn't give my whole bio, like the way that you shared at the beginning. Like, you had a great, again, I'm hiring you just to share my story. But the way that you shared that's not how I reached out to you. That wouldn't do anything. There's a right and wrong way to do it. And I find that unfortunately, most people do it wrong. But this goes beyond podcasting. This goes to people that are trying to pick up clients through LinkedIn is really common, right? LinkedIn messages. I get some really terrible LinkedIn messages from people that probably have a good heart, but the way they word their messaging is like, man, I don't think I can work with you. I don't know if I want to. I don't have time to read this book that you sent me, right? There's so many things that are done wrong in it. I've definitely found there's a few key elements that help to really do pitching correctly. I'd love to share those if you'd be all right with that just for a moment.
Yeah, please tell us, because there are listeners who perhaps have already been a guest on podcasts, or maybe because of their experience and expertise and wisdom are potential guests for podcasts out there. And so what can they do that might help them appear attractive to a host?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say, and you mentioned Podmatch, which I'm so thankful that you mentioned that, George. Have a place, whether it's Podmatch or not, where you can have all of your information, like the fast information, so you don't have to put it all in a message. It's that way you can put that link into a message with somebody. So you don't have to be like, here's the 30 things I've done. Here's a picture of me. Here's this, right? Have all those things somewhere. And I can easily get you and your audience kind of a list of the things that they should have. That's pretty easy to find. I can get you a link for that. Actually, if you just go to podpros.com/guesting, podpros.com/guesting, there's a list of 12 things you can look at that'll help you be able to set up a really nice one sheet. Again, you don't need to use my services. That's something you can just look at as a free resource. But once you're actually getting to the pitching, you want to keep it short. So again, have that link where you can send them more details. But the first thing I always tell people is to lead with value. Lead with value. Leading with value simply means to me to actually care is to start off. So George, like when I reached out to you to be on your show, I liked the name of the show. I liked the description. I liked your voice. I was like, man, this sounds pretty cool. But that wasn't enough. I could have led with that. I was like, no, I'm going to listen to an episode. I picked an episode. And as a matter of fact, I want to recommend that episode because it goes well with what we're talking about today, because we're not going to get into storytelling today, but it's with Graham Brown. And he talked about the 3-box storytelling technique. That's episode 68 of Your Intended Message. Go listen to that episode. Phenomenal. As soon as I listened to that, I had the lead with value section done. I had listened to that. I liked it a lot. And I liked it so much, I left a review of the podcast. So when I reached out to George, I told him, hey, I left you a review of your podcast. I listened to this episode. I got a lot from it. I learned how to tell better stories. And then once I did that, the next thing I did, so number 2, that's lead with value. And then number 2 is to make a meaningful request. A lot of people, when they're doing pitching, they don't actually ever make the request. They just kind of leave it open-ended. And a lot of podcast hosts or potential clients are just kind of like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? Give them a clear action, something they can take. So I actually made a meaningful request. I told George, hey, here's a spot that I think I could add value to your audience. Would you be willing and interested to having me on the podcast? And that that gave him the chance to actually say yes or no to me. The third thing I'll mention is to offer credibility. And offering credibility simply means that if I know somebody that knows George, I'm going to reference their name and be like, hey, if you want to talk to Tiffany, she's a mutual friend of ours, you can reach out to her. I was on her podcast. Anything to add a little bit of credibility to show that, you know what, you have some skin in the game at that place, or I spoke at this conference last year, or I've been on 30 podcasts in the last year, anything that's going to help, something really short. And then the next thing I'm going to mention is to make it easy to say no. This is kind of how I end the thing, is I usually make it really easy. So a lot of people, they just don't hear back. You don't hear back from people that you're pitching about your business idea or that you're pitching to be on their podcast because they don't want to break your heart. If you already did all those nice things, now they're feeling like they can't really hurt your feelings. I always say, hey, no pressure at all. I only want to be on your podcast if you think I can add value to the audience. If not, it's probably better that we don't do this. Leaving open end like that, I've heard a lot of no's in my time. A lot of people have said, no, thank you, but I really appreciate it. They wouldn't usually respond to other people, which is leave out in limbo forever. I personally like to hear back. And so that's something that's really worked for me. And then the last thing I always like to do is when I kind of have like a signing off tagline is I like to mention that I'll share the episode because in all honesty, I will. I love to share episodes I've been a guest on, and not all guests do that. So if you do that, only if you're willing to, like, don't lie. If you're willing to share it, mention that, because that as a host is like, oh, great, this guest is actually going to help me promote a little bit, which is a tough thing that we have to deal with on the hosting side of the mic. But anyway, that's kind of the 5 steps that I've got, George. Sorry to go on a little rant there for you.
That was perfect. And those are all valuable tips for potential guests to keep in mind. And every one of them are important to me. I go through that thinking process when I review. And the most important one, if I could say there was one that's more important, the most important one for me is what you can do for my guests. And you appreciate that my guests are important to me. And I'll give you an example of a message that I recently received, an introduction from a potential guest who wanted to be on my show. The person looked like they had a little bit of credibility. However, they had 3 sentences, and each one of them started with the word I.
Mm. I know what that means.
So the answer is no. You can't, you don't care about my guest. You don't even know anything about my show. You didn't even acknowledge the name. Like, come on, stop. How can you sell yourself? If that's the way you come across to me, what are you going to sound like to my listeners? You're not interested in helping them. So yes, valuable information. Now, Alex, some people might be thinking, well, okay, I like listening to podcasts, but why would I ever want to be on a podcast? What's in it for me?
Yeah, that's an interesting question right there. And I will do my best to keep this really short, George. I'm gonna try to have an intended message right here. I always go back to the name of your podcast because I love it. But the first thing I'm gonna mention is a lot of people in businesses, they do ads on social media these days, or even in search engines now. That's a good thing to do. But even if you're just doing actual like campaigns on your own social platforms, people are scrolling past you. And I don't say that to be mean or to say that it doesn't work. It has its place by all means, but you are paying for people to, or spending your time on things that people are going to scroll right past, because that's just the nature of the beast with social media. Again, has its place, that's fine. But if you want to develop three things that are very important for any business or individual, is know, like, and trust. Those three things are extremely important. Know, like, and trust. It's really hard to know if I like, know, or trust you if I'm just scrolling past a post of yours on social media. Now, eventually it might click, but here's the way I can tell if I really know, like, or trust somebody is to listen to them on a podcast. If they have my undivided attention for 20 to 30 minutes and I'm just listening to them, I can usually tell those three things pretty fast. That to me is the power of podcasting. And to give a quick little story on that, George, recently I was wanting to get into some SMS marketing. So I was signing up with a company that basically gives you a phone number you can text out to people and stuff, just to kind of with my inner circle type of thing. I found three companies through Google searches, and all three had great social media. So the next thing I did is I went to podcasts and I started typing SMS marketing. And I found on the podcast app, I found one person who was with one of these three companies who was on a bunch of podcasts. I started listening to them, and he wasn't telling people to go buy his product. He was saying, here's how you succeed. Here's things I've done that have worked. Here's things our company has developed that have worked for people. And guess what? I went and bought that product. Then I was curious. I was like, I wonder where that one aligned with the cost. And that was actually the most expensive of the three services. But I went with it because I felt that I could know, like, and trust those individuals versus the other two. That not that they were bad companies. I just didn't have the same relationship with them that I now had. That to me is a gist like of the power of podcast guesting.
And what I'm hearing too, Alex, is that if you're a business leader, if you're spending money or time on marketing of any form, especially social media, because everybody tells you need to be there, and you wonder, well, yeah, we're spending all this money and we're getting likes, but nothing else. But you got to remember, people are getting tired and bored of the social media, and they know it's not all true. And advertising is even worse because we know you're just lying about yourself. You're bragging. You're not really that good. But if we can get a chance to know you, to have a conversation with you, or to listen in on a conversation with you, now there's a chance to build a relationship.
Yeah, and I think that relationship is the way that marketing and business is going more than ever. Think about it, George, like how different is the world now than it just was a few years ago? Like even just with human to human connection. I think maybe back then we had, maybe I'm just guessing here. I'm not like getting into the psychology and stuff like that, but I think that we had better human connections in our lives just a few years ago than we have now. So we didn't mind the roboticness of things like advertising and stuff. But now people are not as into that. People want some sort of human connection. We want to feel like we belong to something. And people do that when they feel like that they're welcomed in. To me, an advertisement has never been like so inviting and welcoming that I felt like, oh, I get the privilege of buying whatever this is, right? But when I hear somebody talk about something they're passionate about, that they've built or that they've done to actually further develop the world or help people, I love that stuff and I'm all in on that. And maybe I'm getting like a little too like whimsical with this type of thing, but in my mind, that's just the way that my head is transformed over the last few years.
And there are guests, and not every guest, to be a podcast guest, you don't have to be a master of the language and be able to just tell wonderful stories. We want to hear you being human and maybe stumble, maybe have a few flaws, not stumble all the way through it, but once in a while you think about a question and say, no, I haven't been asked that before, or that's interesting. Or we want to hear that, we want to feel that you're human, you're imperfect, and that you're being totally honest with us.
George, that's such an insightful point. I'll tell you what, I've realized that too in podcasting. Like if somebody wants to hear the big production, they're going to go listen to the NPRs of the world, or the Wanderers. And those are like the big podcasts that have, I mean, they literally cost six figures per episode to produce. There's so many people working on it. If people want to hear that, they'll go to those big productions. People want to feel human. If you and me are just completely perfect, which George, you're pretty close, like I got some work. But if we are basically perfect and every episode is just perfectly scripted all the way through, no errors, it's not really human anymore. People want to feel like they're part of something. It's a very insightful thing that you bring up there. And I think it gives people permission to say, you know what? I might not be the most well-spoken person in the world, but I know I can help somebody take one step in the right direction in their life based off my experience. If you're saying that and you're listening to this, if you're listening to your intended message and heard me say that, you owe it to yourself and to the world to get out there and share that message. even if you stumble along the way a little bit, people like me and George are going to forgive you because we know that it's adding value to the people that are listening and trusting us with their time because they want to hear another human who's just maybe one step further along than they are to help them make that right step.
If there's a business leader listening now, and they're thinking, well, I never really been on a podcast, but I did speak at some seminar, and I was on a couple panels. How do I know what's the right podcast I should be on? How do I know it's even the right audience that I should be talking to? What can they do? How do they find that out?
Oh, that's such a good point. Most people think that it's just kind of like a spray and pray method. Like you get out there and jump on as many as you can. So you talk about walking your dog, you talk about your business trip you did last year, you talk about your company, you talk about everything. That's not a really good tactic because you're not going to find that it really leads to anything. It really takes some self-reflection and some even deep. If you have a business, you have a marketing team, ask them like what should you be talking about and help them get them to help you identify. But if you're alone and you're running solo, think about the main message that you want to get out to the world that's going to, one, help people first and foremost, but two, also drive people back to your products or services that, again, can further help them. So it's like, okay, it added value through the podcast, but if they're looking to take that to the next level, they can work with me on that. If you can answer those questions and head in that direction, those are the podcasts you want to be on. You can only really learn that by listening. You could look at podcast titles and descriptions all day, but you've got to sit down and listen to the podcast to understand who it's really going to be for. And like, so example, that's why I listened to your intended message before I ever reached out to George, because I wanted to make sure that, no, I can add value there. And I believe I'm adding some value today, hopefully to some people, right? Like I'm not here today being like, ooh, I missed the mark on this one. But early on, when I used to like just go on any podcast I could, I'd get done with it and be like, that maybe was fun for someone to listen to, maybe help somebody, but I don't really know the purpose of me being on that. I'm spending my energy on something that might not be useful. So it's a matter of really sitting down and thinking about it for yourself and find the direction you want to go in, and then identifying shows that align with that positioning that you have.
And how, when you're a guest, and you mentioned that you've been a guest on many podcasts already, and I know you're a person about routines. What's your routine for getting ready for the podcast?
So listening first and foremost, right? That's really important. I like to do a pre-call, which, George, by the way, you're one of the few hosts that still does that type of thing where we jump on a call, because I got to make sure the synergy is good. Because here's the thing, we could jump on a call and just both agree that, okay, you don't get my sense of humor, or I think you're really offensive, right? Like those type of things could totally happen. You don't know that unless you jump on a call before the actual recording. So I try my best to get a host to do that. Some just don't, and that's fine. But I do my best to listen as much as I can and then prepare. So I want to know like what the topic is. I want to be ready. And while I'm preparing, I'm thinking about, okay, I already know this is aligned with me because I did reach out and pitch. So I already know it's aligned with me and my audience that I'm looking to really impact and help. And then from there, I just make sure that anything I'm going to share is going to be helpful to the audience. Like I don't want to share stories that have nothing to do with anything. I want to get through that stuff as quickly as I can. So I just always take a little bit of note taking. I spend the last, I'd say 30 minutes before we jump on, I'm just getting myself ready. And usually that's listening to the host podcast while I'm getting the room ready, right? Or just taking a little bit more notes. And so there's not like a real formula to it, although I'm a routine habit guy, George. I was hoping I had more for you there, but it's really just something that kind of naturally flows based off me just diving all into that show and that host's life for a little bit.
And I suppose, and while you're talking, I was thinking about another advantage of podcasts, of being on a podcast, is that you're reaching people when they are probably most relaxed or most open. It's not like we're having a meeting in the boardroom. Oh, the salesperson's here. Okay, send him into the boardroom. I'll go meet with him. First, I'll go put my armor on and put on my ugly face. Give a hard time. Don't make it easy for the salespeople. But when we're listening to a podcast, we're doing it when we're setting up the room, going for a walk, walking the dog, maybe driving the car. But we're doing it in those times when we are not being defensive. We're more open.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of podcasting, George, is the fact that for me, when I'm cleaning the house, which is something it sounds weird, but I enjoy doing that, like straightening up once a week and get everything looking nice. I listen to podcasts. I must retain 90% of what I hear when I'm doing that. Because for me, I'm a little bit ADD. So if I'm doing something with my hands and I'm able just to listen, I can comprehend better than any other way. And I think that a lot of people, they're able to learn like that. And in podcasting, because this is the beauty of it, it doesn't require me to look at anything. It doesn't require me to read anything. I just put in my ears and I listen. I can listen at the speed that I want to as well. And I happen to do 1.2 speed is what I like to listen to. So a little bit faster than the normal. By the way, when I'm preparing to be on a podcast, I do it at just the normal speed, so I don't hear your voice incorrectly, right? So a little fun hack for everybody there. But no, I think it's just people are primed to learn. As a matter of fact, I was looking at some podcasting stats, and these polls have been independently done by a lot of companies, but I trust one called Convince and Convert, and they talk about how 75% of people who listen to podcasts listen to learn something new. So people are actually listening to learn, which I think is a really cool thing for guys like you and me that are podcasters, right? Like we're able to help people get that knowledge that they're looking for.
And so the podcast becomes a vehicle for helping people, helping them learn and demonstrating our expertise, our comfort with the learning process, and our willingness to share before we even get a check.
Right. 100%. I think that's the beauty of it all. Like it's probably why I love podcasting, why I've gone all in on it. It's just the fact that it's adding value and then potentially earning business as a result. And if you don't, you still barely help somebody take a step or two, which is fantastic.
Let's take a look at a couple of the services. The Pod Pros, podpros.com. What's that all about? Who should look at that, and what will they get from going there?
Yeah, so anyone interested in podcasting on either side of the mic, this is like our parent company. So you'll see the other two businesses, Podmatch and Podcast SOP. And we have more businesses we're planning on launching. We just needed a hub for all of it. So we weren't having like 100 social media platforms for each of these things. We wanted a hub, and we really wanted to focus on the education side of things. And we just recently launched that. It's newer. And the whole idea is just, hey, can we help these people that are on either side of the mic really just elevate their podcasting game and take it to the next level to have a bigger impact on the world? So Pod Pros is all about really that education side of things. And then again, serves as kind of like the landing page for all of our products and services.
So either guests, potential guests, or host, or current guests or hosts who want to up their game, there's a place to look for new information, tips, techniques, because it is a skill. There's no question. There's a skill. And I was lucky when I started my podcast. I previously had hosted a radio show for 19 years. So I made most of the mistakes over those 19 years that I was able to write into my procedures for this podcast. And that's what you've done. That's what you've done for hosts and guests to make it easier for them. Because there are mistakes. People do make mistakes, and you think if you're a guest, you think I don't have to prepare. I'll just show up and answer the questions. Well, okay, you might want to think about who you're talking to, who the listener are, and what's valuable to them. And by the way, here's a news flash. Not every host is a good host. Not every question is a good question. So what do you do when you get asked a question that you don't want to answer or is poorly worded? So there's a question I'll throw to you, Alex. What do you do when that happens?
George, I am going to turn this one back on you in a minute, but I'll answer it first. Yeah, when you do that, you have to remember where the direction is that you can add value. So it all starts again by making sure you did your due diligence. If you have an idea who the audience is and what you're going to share, you can turn around a bad question by answering it really quickly and maybe just bringing it back around to the host. A lot of hosts will ask bad questions, unfortunately. I don't say it to be mean. It's just the nature of it. People are trying maybe. They're just not sure what to ask yet. So you want to make sure you keep your answer somewhat short and then redirect it back to something else. Or you can even say, hey, that's an interesting question. It makes me think about this question that I'd like to answer, type of thing. Just a way to like have respect in the moment, right? Like you have to be respectful. And then you want to bring it back around. And George, I had a question here. You're a really good host. You've got a big background. If I'm planning on being a guest, how do I even know if a host is good or not? Like that was a question I was wondering if you would have an answer for, because if I'm doing my due diligence, what are some signs maybe to know if somebody is good or not?
Well, okay, it starts with, is the host any good, or what's their style? And it starts with, as you did, do your homework and listen to at least one podcast, maybe a couple, just to get, and you don't have to listen to the whole one unless you like it, but you're looking for style, and you're looking for, are they encouraging? Are they, do they stumble? Are they really listening? And for example, I was listening to a podcast recently, and I noticed how the guest would say something, and it was like they were dropping crumbs of information, of doorways, and the host was listening because the host would pick up on that crumb and then go and explore it. They would open it. And so here's one way that you know that the host is a poor host, and I was guilty of this in the beginning of my radio show. This is where they come with a list of questions. We will ask you the question and you will answer the question, and then I will ask you the next question. I don't care what your answer was. I'm just going to ask you the question because that's what my plan is. And so when you hear that mechanical question that seems to have nothing to do with what just happened before, you know the host is an amateur. And there's hope for them, but they're currently an amateur. So you as a guest need to be better prepared to help them out. And the host isn't mean-spirited. They just don't know what they don't know. And at least they're trying, and you can help them get through that. And you're right. When you get asked that question that is not a good question, you say, well, I think the question that's most relevant to your listeners is, and then you pose the question and you answer, and the host will love you because
Yes.
they just want to keep the conversation going. They're not going to say you didn't answer my question. They're going to go, thanks for saving me.
That is so true. I've never met a host, because here's the thing. I've had guests on my show that I've asked some bad questions. I'm thinking back to the early days where I got a 3-word answer and there's nowhere for me to go with it. It would have been way better if they're like, hey, Alex, I think the better question is this. I wouldn't even edit that out. I would keep that right in there. I think that would be great. But instead of just being, yeah, I think so, I'm over here on the other side of the mic like, oh, what do I say next? Like, where does the conversation go? You kind of killed the conversation. You bring up some good points though, George. That was helpful for me even.
Alex, in wrapping up, I'd like to, if you could offer our listeners, business leaders who are thinking about or wondering about, should they pursue podcasts as a way of getting their message out there, of building relationship, if you could give them 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice, and maybe it's something you've said already, what might those pieces of advice be?
Yes. Step 1 is to start with why. Like, what would the reason for it be? You might go through this practice of trying to determine the why for podcast guesting, or even maybe starting a podcast, but you might just find that there isn't really one there. If there's not, don't feel like you have to do this. This is just another method that you can use. But if you go through and you develop a really strong why and realize, you know what, I know I can add value and I know I can drive sales and it can be a great form of marketing for our organization, then do that. But start with why is the most important thing. From there, don't overly invest. And I don't say that to be cheap or anything like that, but you don't need to go buy an $800 mic or build a recording studio. If you have the basics, if you have just a $50 mic or some sort of webcam or a new computer that has those things basically built in these days, you should have enough, as long as you can get into a good quiet room, to give it a shot. See if it works. Jump on a few podcasts. And the last thing I'll mention is, do not just go for the big shows. And I say the big shows, I'm thinking like Joe Rogan, right? Like these giant shows that have millions of people listening. That should not be your goal to get on those shows. You have to think about who is the most niche focus that has my most ideal listener. Like, who has the most ideal listener that could learn from me in it? If you find a podcast with 40 or 50 people listening, it doesn't sound like a big number. And that's because we compare it to social media. So we look at, that only got 40, 30 likes. That's not a lot. But if I told you, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Business Owner, I've got a stage in the other room with 40 people sitting down in seats that want to hear from you, and all of them are your ideal client, would you not run to that opportunity? Podcast guesting is more that opportunity than just something like scrolling on social media, although both are powerful in their own realms, of course. But those would be my 3 big things I would start everybody off with, George.
Powerful tips, Alex, for people who are considering or might be considering to being a guest on a podcast. My guest today is Alex Sanfilippo, reminding you that whether it's to become a guest or to be a host or even sell a product or service, lead with value.
Absolutely, George. Thank you so much. Sorry, I didn't know if you wanted me to respond there. My bad. I thought it was a great sign off. That was good, though. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Terrific. Thank you. Yes, we're done.
If you like what you heard, remember to like, comment, and share this podcast. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you convey your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.